Welcome to the Simpleton Podcast, the most famous podcast in eternity, with your hosts, Laura Heeman and Clark Massey. And we have a special guest today, a Renaissance man, Patrick Flynn. Patrick is kind of accomplished in the world of workouts, personal training. He's also host of the Philosophy for the People podcast. And he's written some interesting books, including some books on essentially how to be a Renaissance man who's good at everything. So we're going to kind of go through that today. And welcome, Patrick.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I found Patrick because I was trying to find the ideal kettlebell book for my workouts, and his pitch came on my YouTube feed, and it was good, and so I bought it. This is strong on. And when I was looking at the book on Amazon, I looked at his bio, and amongst other things, it mentioned, that he had a bunch of kids, that he wrote a book called The Best Argument for God, and that he hosted a philosophy podcast. So I was like, oh, is this guy Catholic? And then I went on his philosophy podcast, and I looked at all the topics, and I saw some Dominicans and Dr. Michael Gorman and some other Catholic philosophers I knew, and I said, I think this guy might be Catholic. I kind of kept looking around his material, and I seemed like a really interesting person, so we're excited to have you on. And I guess maybe we'll start talking about kettlebells. And I think a reason why I think you're a great person is I think a lot of our listeners have young children or kind of busy parents, and the idea of fitting an effective workout in life is daunting. And you pitch a minimalist generalist approach, and I was wondering if you could tell us about that, what that is.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Laura. So kind of interesting that you found me through the kettlebell world, because most Catholics know me for the work I've done related to philosophy. Yeah. And then they're like, oh, this guy's also into this weird thing that's like a cannonball with a handle on it. What's that? So this is an interesting turn of events, to be sure. So yeah, the kettlebell is essentially that. It's a cannonball with a handle on it, right? Let me give a little bit of background. So fitness is not my formal academic background. That's philosophy. But I was your typical overweight, out of shape 90s kid, right? You grow up when pretty much the only exercise you do is sitting and resting, lots of video games, lots of sugary cereals, that sort of thing. By high school, I decided through a confluence of different embarrassing events to get my act together, and I joined a martial arts gym, Taekwondo, and I fell in love with it. I had a great coach who really kind of taught me the real basic no BS principles of fitness and nutrition and stuff like that. Just fell in love with all things physical culture, really wanted to kind of master myself physically, because I noticed it also helped a lot mentally. And I got quite competitive with it. So I competed Taekwondo throughout college. And when I went to college to be on the Taekwondo team, that's when I was introduced to kettlebells. My coach at that time brought me to his gym. It was this very underground, grungy gym, just kind of the thing that any guy in college would just naturally sort of fall in love with, right? Felt like Fight Club. And he had these weird looking things that look like cannonballs with a handle. And he's like, I want you to start using these. I think you'll like them. I think they'll help with your training efficiency. And as soon as I started performing some of those basic kettlebell exercises, I felt like, yeah, this is something I could seriously get into. So I fell in love with those. And as I was, going through college, just as a way to pay bills, I just got all sorts of trainer certifications. I got my kettlebell certification at the time. It was called the Russian Kettlebell Challenge certification. I was actually the youngest person to ever do that at the time. And taught like crazy. Taught personal training, large group classes. I taught at the college. I taught at the local Y. I taught at the gym where I was training martial arts. So really put in a lot of time into that. and learned a ton, just kind of in the trenches about how to use the kettlebell to get people good general fitness results. You know, you mentioned the idea of generalism, and that's the idea of just not being a hyper specialist. We don't care about being a professional power lifter or bodybuilder. We just want to be good to great, or at least fairly competent at pretty much everything. We want to be strong, lean, mobile, flexible, have great endurance, good grip strength, all that sort of stuff, right? And we want to be time efficient. The kettlebell is a great tool for that. I sometimes describe it as like the Swiss Army knife of functional fitness. It can do a whole bunch of stuff really well. There might be other tools that could do specific things better, but for most people, most of the time, like this is all you need if you're just looking for good, general, efficient fitness solutions. So that's where that's coming from. And, you know, just again, through a series of just sort of odd events, even though it was not my sort of academic focus, I just wound up kind of making my living that way. I had my first book deal to write a book on fitness from Wiley before I was even finished my undergrad. So
Wiley is the books for dummies?
It was, yeah. My first book was actually a for dummies book. Yeah.
Okay. I've never met anyone that wrote one of those books, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I had a lot of pros and cons to that, but I overall, you know, grateful for the opportunity. It was a great opportunity. And it helped me to sort of launch my business, which I still run today, my online business that focuses on essentially everything we just talked about. You know, busy people, often parents with lots of kids, just looking for good, quick ways to get in shape at home. So that's kind of what I do in terms of the paying the mortgage side of my life. Yeah.
Now, Pat, like when I've seen your workout videos, you're like jacked up in some of these videos. Like you're a pretty strong guy, right? But like when I find my attraction to working out, like I have like no desire any longer to be an athlete or anything. I'm just trying to like not die of a heart attack while my kids are young.
It's a great goal.
And I'm trying to like make sure I'm active enough while they're in high school that we can like canoe and stuff, you know?
Yeah.
One of the things that changed my life, which like I don't think Laura and I have ever mentioned kettlebells on our podcast, but independently, Laura and I don't even think we knew each other. We're kind of into it. But one of the podcasts that changed my life was listening to Pavel
Tsatsouline
on Rogan in 2019.
He's the guy I was originally certified under. That's right. RKC was his organization. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the podcast was kind of hilarious because it was like I'd always like I went to college out here in Kansas, you know, and I'd always heard of this thing that they'd talk about farmer strong.
Farmer strong, dad strong.
Right. That basically these guys would show up, you know, off the farm to play football, and they would be surprised that they'd never picked up a weight before, but they were strong, you know? And Pavel's talking about this, about how these weights are kind of the old industrial weights that used to be on scales, like for the railroads and stuff. I've picked up a few old railroad weights here at like an estate sale, and they're just like kettlebells, except they're not good for swinging because they're squarish.
Yeah, of course.
You know, but they have a nice handle on them, you know? But anyway, I thought that was, his idea was like, you do a set. It could even just be one Turkish get up, and then you just like walk around. And so I like do my laundry. I literally do it in my basement, walk up, wash a couple dishes, go back down, do some swings, change the laundry between the dryer and the thing, then do some more, you know? And I thought this is like awesome, you know, for like a parent.
What Pavel is getting at there is this, and he's been talking about this for years, but it's not a crazy concept. It's pretty traditional. Before like bodybuilding took over, and that is that strength is a skill, right? And you treat it as a form of practice, or really just trying to get like a certain degree of efficiency out of our nervous system, right? Neuromuscular efficiency. And there's no reason that you have to like beat yourself to death to get stronger. You just have to practice things. You have to practice certain movements, and at least some of the time you have to use a certain amount of intensity. But that could mean just a few, you know, reps here or there that are really kind of spread out with tons. Like the old time approach to strength, you usually had like tons of rest between sets. Why? Because you wanted to be as fresh as possible before your next, you know, practice, if you will, right? I think that this makes a lot of sense. It's well established that if you just want to get strong in terms of limit strength or absolute strength, then yeah, it's a good mindset to take, but it's so kind of not the mainstream approach to fitness where people are like, I need to feel like I'm dying, I'm sweating like crazy, I'm super sore, filled with lactic acid. No, those things have a place. They're good for certain things.
Is that what you prefer yourself? Like to work out real hard, get that sore feeling? Because I think that's where Laura's at, by the way.
Yeah, it depends what you're going for, right? So if you're just trying to be like, you want the unitard and the mustache, and you want to like get really good at doing the old-fashioned bent press, then you should. Nothing wrong with what you're talking about, Clark, right? You just want to be like old school strong, right? Do a few bent presses or deadlifts, go do your laundry, come back, blah blah blah, rinse and repeat. But if you want to like engage in functional types of bodybuilding where you're now trying to grow muscle, you're going after a certain aesthetic, you want to improve your overall conditioning, you're interested in body recomposition, fat loss and muscle and stuff like that. Can you do it with that old school approach? Yeah, but it just wouldn't be the most efficient way to go about it, right? So everything is it's teleological, right? To use a technical term, right? It's like, well, what are you aiming at? What's your goal? What are you going for?
So if you're a guy trying to woo the women, you do not want to do the more relaxed way. You want to do this like, harder workout way. But if you're married and just trying to be healthy, this other
so yeah, let's draw distinctions. Philosophers are really annoying about this, right? Fitness and health, not the same thing, right? So fitness is something like the ability to perform a task, right? Health is something like the ideal interplay of the organs and bodily systems, right? And these things can obviously come apart. You could take somebody who's doing that old school approach and like blow their back out, right? Right? So they get really fit at a specific task, say just lifting a bunch of weight overhead. But they could be smoking, they could be drinking like a lot of those old guys did, right? They would have cigarettes between sets, and a lot of whiskey. They weren't particularly healthy. Now, they might have been healthier than they otherwise would have been if they weren't lifting and they were just smoking and drinking, right? But they were fit. They were good at a specific task. But that doesn't have to be the case. It's just that health is generally something that's a little bit wider than just fitness. And my goal, what I promote, is making sure that whatever you're doing fitness-wise, it should minimally not be taking away from your health. And a lot of times that's the case. You just think of when people become hyper specialists, right? They start to try to be the best in the world at some particular task. Generally, it's unhealthy, right? Like once you cross that line, just look at most professional athletes. Like, yeah, they got decent stamina, stuff like that, but they're busted up. And that's just sort of a cost of doing business. I'm not making any further judgments, if somebody, that's what they want, that's just kind of like, people are in that game, though, that's the price you pay, right? You have a messed up brain, your joints are broken, blah, blah, blah. But you have the glory of all those raving fans and stuff like that, right? But most people, most of the time, aren't worried about that. What they really want is to be fit. Like, they want to be able to perform lots of tasks. They want to be able to lift a good amount of weight. They want to be able to crawl on the ground with their kids. They want to be able to run a mile without passing out. But they also want to make sure they don't have a heart attack, that when they go and get their health screens, that things come back positively. So they want this sort of mutual reinforcement between health and fitness. So fitness efforts can improve your health. They can take away from your health depending on how you go about it. And oftentimes it's a lot of kind of dose poison type of deal, right? Like you could do the same types of things, but depending on how much you're doing them and how intensely you're doing them, could give you a eustress, a positive stress, which makes you healthier, or it could ultimately be a distress, something that breaks you down. So it's no easy answer to that question, but that's how I would start to approach it. Yeah.
Just an interesting thing with fitness is how quickly it can lead to vanity or it's like
usually it's vanity that leads to fitness, right?
Well, that's interesting.
It works both ways.
Yeah, I guess it works both ways. Yes, but I think that's like I don't know. But you start working out and you start feeling good and looking a little bit better, and I feel like it can reinforce maybe. So I don't know. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, first, guilty as charged, right? So my first motivation into fitness was like, I just wanted to stop looking so bad, right? And feeling so bad. Which
that's like not necessarily being...
No, that's fine. That's a normal, good response, right? And like, there are certain states that we're in where like, guilt and negative feelings are the appropriate response. So like our world is totally wacky. Like you should never feel guilt. That's insane. There's lots of things you should feel guilty over,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Believe me. So that's, it can get out of whack, but for most people it's perfectly appropriate, right? What are you going to do about it is the question. But then once I started looking good, oh yeah, I fell into the vanity, like college kid, huge vanity trap, like hugely ego driven. And that's another issue. I mean, it gets us into like a wider philosophical topic of virtue ethics, right? Because what makes certain things good on the whole, if we talk to Aristotle, is not just the action and the circumstances, blah blah, but it's also the intent, right? What is your intent behind it? So you might be doing like good fitness efforts and you might be doing them in a way that's health promoting, but if you're doing them for the wrong sorts of reasons, right, that you start forming a sort of bad moral character, then it just that badness sort of wraps around the whole. I would say on the whole, right, what we have is a bad or negative state of affairs. So yeah, we want to avoid that. I think for me, I mean, my personal switch there was when I became Catholic, right? It made me fundamentally sort of reevaluate why I do everything and anything at all. So I do a lot of the same things now that I did in college. My training is pretty similar, but I would like to think now that I do them for a better collection of reasons than just wanting to take pictures of my abs or something. Right? Yeah.
Yeah. I have okay, another question.
Nothing wrong with wanting to look good, by the way. Let me do like that's fine, right?
Yeah.
But if it becomes like this hyper obsessive focus, that's a problem, right? Yeah.
Right. I think like in my state, like a lot of my friends who are moms, like we just want to feel like our clothes fit okay, and we can look cute if we dress up to go out on a date or something, But yeah. So in Strong On, you have a lot of different workouts, some of which I have tried and enjoyed, but they're like 20-minute workouts. Can someone like I think most of us are used to thinking you got to spend, a couple hours at the gym to get results, but you can get results with 20 minutes.
Absolutely. The hour thing is a bit arbitrary, right? I mean, you can train for an hour, right? There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it is a bit arbitrary. I mean, it as always, it depends what you're going for, and I wouldn't recommend working out for just 20 minutes one day per week, right? But if you're doing it 3-5 days per week, that cumulative volume makes a substantial difference. Of course, depending on how you spend those 20 minutes. But yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You can get this sort of intensity and volume that we know, as well established, that facilitates the sorts of body transformation people are looking for. And not only that, but just in practice, what you find is when you give people shorter time frames to work out in, you see Parkinson's law kick in. Parkinson's law is that work tends to either expand or contract to fit the amount of time allotted to it. And same thing, when people have an hour to work out, they spend probably about half of it on Instagram, right? Suddenly, when you've got to get all this done in 20 minutes, you don't open the app as much.
Yeah.
Set.
Yeah, totally.
So there tends to be an inherent efficiency boost when you give people, say only 20 to 30 minutes to get their assignments done.
Yeah, I like that. I like that aspect, like you're putting the timer on, because I was having this issue where I'd be like, okay, let me get ready for my workout. Okay, gonna do like an hour. And then all of a sudden I'm like, I just spent the whole morning doing like, my supposedly 1 hour workout. So I don't know. I don't feel like I have that kind of time. So.
I found a big time thing for me is like, I don't think I can go to a gym, because it's like you have to get dressed to go to the gym. You got to travel to the gym. You got to shower when you're done and travel back from the gym. And that's at least 40 minutes on top of the workout, and like having it in your basement or just having something you can do at home already saves me 40 minutes before I've even started,
100%. Yeah. That's most of my audience. I say my audience because it's ironically not myself. I do like to go to the gym, but that's because I'm in the house all day. I work so like I just need to get out of the house, right? But when I'm super busy, I still have my kettlebells like right out on the back deck, and of course it's like those are there so when I'm in those situations, which are not infrequent, it still can get done, right? Mm-hmm.
I think another positive aspect is like it's sort of minimal investment money wise, right? It's I think you recommend having like 3 bells, right, of different weights, and you don't need a lot of stuff.
Somebody read the book. That's great.
Yeah, someone read the book.
Yeah, no, I think for most people, most of the time, that's my like safe saying, right? As long as I say that, it keeps me safe, right? Oh, you're an exception? Okay, well, then, fine. 3 kettlebells is great, right? So for like men, assuming you've got, you're averagely fit or whatever, something like kettlebells are weird. They still come in kilograms most of the time. So something like, an 8 kilogram, a 16 kilogram, and a 20 or 24 kilogram, that's going to cover a ton of exercises, and like you won't outgrow those anytime soon, right? For ladies, something maybe like a 6, a 12, and a 16, something around those ranges, right? Again, upper body, lower body, single kettlebell, double kettlebell, a ton you can do with that. A little bit of an upfront investment. It's not a total bank breaker, but I mean, they're like indestructible. Nothing's going to knock these things out of existence anytime soon. So they're going to last you for a very long time. You'll get a ton of mileage out of them. They don't take up much space, and they don't cost all that much money. So I think it is quite practical, right?
Yeah.
Could you point people towards your workout resources?
Yeah.
Or what?
Gladly. Yeah. Self-promotion all day long. Right? So I don't actually sell kettlebells. So never wanted to. I hate the idea of like having some sort of inventory or something like that. I just sell information, as weird as that sounds. I sell programs. I sell, and I don't just sell, I've got lots of free resources too. So for free resources, people might want to check out my YouTube channel. I've got 2, but the more recent one is called Kettlebell Quickies, and it's just quick kettlebell workouts for busy people. That's on YouTube. But the best resource that's free would probably be go to the website 101kettlebellworkouts.com. That's the numbers 101kettlebellworkouts.com. It's just a free PDF of, you guessed it, 101 kettlebell workouts, totally free. That'll get you on my email list. And I share lots of free stuff through email, but I also have, I point to other programs and stuff too if people want to go a little bit deeper. So that'd be the place to go.
Well, let's talk about your labor of love that probably makes you no money. Am I cutting you off, yeah. Laura? You got more kettlebells?
No. I think that's good for kettlebells. I did forget earlier. I wanted to ask you about. I guess you gave us kind of your fitness background, but I wanted to ask you about your family and coming into the church and getting a philosophy degree and
I think that's probably a good segue into philosophy if we want to chat that. So, all right, family, real quick. Married 10 years over that now to my wonderful wife Christine, who is also a Catholic convert, and her conversion paralleled mine, but was legitimately different than mine as well. She's got a book too out with Catholic Answers, where it's called. I should know this.
Not just spiritual?
Not just spiritual. Thank you, Laura. Because she was very like New Agey, right? And so she details her conversion account there. As for me, we have 6 children, by the way. As for me, I was always into philosophy before I knew what philosophy was. I think the more I've thought about it and talked to other philosophers, you realize that like an interest in philosophy is actually a congenital disorder, right? It's just sort of this weird obsession you have from a very young age of asking all these sorts of strange questions.
I think I heard you say on a podcast or something that you used to wonder if everything around you was real at a young age.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, so one of my very early memories is being I was at my grandparents' a lot, looking out their window and outside of Philadelphia, and just like having this deep sort of anxiety of like, why doesn't this stuff just all evaporate into nothing? Like forget about where it came from. Why is it just, what holds it in existence, right? And that was just like a deeply fascinating yet troubling question to me. And it didn't seem like other people were having these sorts of thoughts. So I just thought I was weird until, and I am weird. I'm not going to get out of that. Until I realized, oh no, these are actually like really big questions that a lot of people who are way smarter than me have asked for a long time. And I was asking a question related to this idea of contingency, that certain things are, but they need not be. Presumably nothing about their sort of nature demands that they exist. So it makes a lot of sense to ask not just why they ever came into existence, even if they did, but why, regardless of their becoming, they continue to exist at all. And right, so I didn't realize that sort of stuff was called philosophy till many, many, many years later, till about middle school, where I'm trying to figure out where I want to take up the faith or philosophy lines here, because I was baptized Catholic, but I didn't have really any sort of religious upbringing at all. I mean, we were your typical creasters, really creasters like only when the grandparents were in town type of deal, right?
Yeah.
So I remember in the sixth grade, just to condense the story a little bit, this is a pivotal moment for me. I remember this will date me. In the sixth grade, I kind of encountered like two like really big objections to the existence of God. I wasn't thinking about it at that time, but they did strike me, kind of, I guess, subconsciously that way. 9/11 happened, so like problem of evil, right? In a real way. And also, science class telling me that the universe is however many billion years old, 13.8 billion years old, and blah, blah, blah. And I just remember thinking, like, okay, that isn't like what I remember being taught by like that one, religious class I went to in the first grade or whatever, right? Like, where's the snake and stuff like that, right? So I had like your typical like science versus religion conflict introduced to me, and the problem of evil. And it wasn't like I was like threw my hands up and declared myself an atheist on the spot or anything like that. But I remember like those were like things that like really got me thinking, like what is this world? What's really going on with the world here? All right, because I've been told kind of one story, even in a very kindergartenish way, and now I'm being told another story and seeing other things that seem to be in serious tension with that previous story, right? Then as I moved along in the years, I was into certain writers that were very religiously antagonistic. I was a big Mark Twain fan, still a big Mark Twain fan. He had an essay called "What is Man," which was kind of arguing for determinism, so the whole classic free will debate. And I remember that really gripped me and got me thinking deeply about those issues. Another writer I was into, people kind of have forgotten this guy's name's H.L. Mencken. He was kind of like an old, very grumpy atheist, right? And he had one of the first English works out on Nietzsche. And so I picked that up. And that sort of like got me into philosophy proper through like the old atheist existentialists. And so, high school, college, that really began to color my worldview as a sort of philosophical naturalist, which naturalism is just a philosophically developed or an attempt at philosophically developing a form of atheism. So had lots of thoughts there for a long time. And just to condense the story, we can talk details if you guys want. Many years later, I just kind of gave up that program. I realized I just don't think it works for a million different reasons around issues I was trying to resolve, issues that we've already talked about, like contingency, but also issues like consciousness, rationality, the moral dimension. How do we make sense of these moral intuitions that we have? I just felt that the atheistic proposals either just obviously failed to explain the things that needed to be explained, or they were obviously ridiculous in trying to what's called eliminate the data. They're eliminativists, which is a position in philosophy where essentially you just kind of deny that the data is what it seems to be, right? So they deny that there are actually any conscious beings, which is about as silly as a statement as anybody could make. Or they're moral nihilists. They deny that there's any moral facts or moral obligations, right? So rather than try to explain these things, they give a story about why these things are not what they seem. They're illusions in a sense. And I didn't see that as a tenable option at all without diving into a sort of like radical skepticism. So did I become Catholic right away? No, I just kind of threw my hands up in a state of deep confusion, right? And
could you tell us where you were at in your life when you were having these thoughts? Like, are you already married? Are you an undergrad? Or
these thoughts are over a very long period of time, right? So it's not like this was all happened on one day. But I do remember when I threw my hands up. I was married. I had 2 kids, so I was a bit older at this point. And I was like sitting in my attic upstairs, and I just was like made the commitment of like just saying, yeah, I don't know what's true, but I'm pretty certain at this point that this isn't it, right? So yeah, somewhere in my mid-20s, I guess, 2 kids, married. So yeah, we originally were not married in the church. And then there was another long period of searching after that, but trying to like broaden my horizons, if you will, of studying, a number of philosophers that I was familiar with in my kind of undergrad philosophy classes, but never really gave like a deep or fair hearing to, like your Aristotle, your Plato, those sorts of guys, right? I don't remember how I stumbled upon Thomas Aquinas or the Thomistic tradition. So when you hear the word Thomism, it just really means a philosophical tradition that comes from the angelic doctor, right? But I do remember that when I read those guys, not just Thomas himself, but those following him, especially more contemporary philosophers like Norris Clarke and Bernard Lonergan, I just like it just hit me like a Mack truck. I would just be like, wow, this worldview, this system seems to make a lot of good rational sense, right? It seems to be able to explain the sorts of things that need to be explained, and it can do it systematically, right? It's not like this arbitrary, Frankenstein's monster of a worldview where you just in a very ad hoc, contrived way just kind of fit things together. But no, it seems to have a beautiful systematic unity and elegance and coherence. It's technical, it's complicated when we get into the weeds, but at the end of the day, it allows us to affirm, pretty much all of our common sense beliefs, right, about the external world and causality and human consciousness and morality and all that sort of stuff. So I often tell people, because it's true, that I really kind of became something of a Thomist before I became a Catholic. But you can't spend too much time in those circles without getting heavy doses of Catholic theology, right? And over time, that starts to break down certain biases that a deeply secular person like I certainly had. I wouldn't have admitted it, but so I realized, okay, so that's what they believe. Well, that's not as crazy as what I thought, right? And actually, I could see why they believe these other things now, and that actually isn't crazy. That actually kind of makes sense. And I became increasingly intrigued to the point where the theology actually seemed to make a great deal of sense to me. And then it became kind of more of a historical question, a historical apologetic question concerning, whether there was decent enough evidence for this resurrection claim, these claims of miracles, and the establishment of the hierarchical church that, with apostolic succession and all that, and tried to answer those, and you can see where I came out on all that, right? Yeah.
Well, I have a question about your Nietzsche days.
I have a question about spirituality. I want to throw in real quick.
Okay.
You were in a secular space, and then you're becoming convinced of Catholicism, right? So take that as it is, but how did this change you spiritually in your marriage? Meaning, like, did you find that your life got a lot harder because now you have a lot more like moral obligations? Did you find your life got a lot easier, or did your marriage get harder or easier?
I want to say what my question was because it's related.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I was already like a very committed Catholic when I first encountered Nietzsche, but I felt like, I really enjoyed, I took a college class and we read Beyond Good and Evil, and I really enjoyed it because I felt like I was like, yes, like this man is taking it, where it would go.
He's a frenemy, as we like to say. Yeah.
Yes,
Did you read Genealogy too? Because that's how I was.
No, just Beyond Good and Evil. Yeah. I had this feeling that it was like it was just like stepping into the abyss, to get into his frame of mind, and I guess like on one side it felt like abyss, and on the other side it was like a purpose, meaning, content. So I wanted to know how that was affecting your life, like being sort of deep. So that's why I think they're related.
So I'll try to tie it together, right? So the great thing about these older atheists is they don't seem to have this sort of naive optimism that so many of the contemporary atheists do, essentially about the reaches of human reason. I think thinkers like Nietzsche were deliciously consistent from an absurd starting point, right? They sort of saw that a denial of the classical theistic tradition seemed to inherently lead to not just a nihilism, but an absurdism, right? And this is the abyss that you're talking about. I mean, Nietzsche, most people know that, he's God is dead. He's a moral nihilist. He's more than that, right? He says without God, there wouldn't even be grammar, right? So like he thinks that you just lose all intelligibility through and through. At least that's what I would argue is what he's about. So in that sense, he's a frenemy, right? He's the guy that like he accepts his starting point, at least he seemed to, but he helps you as the Christian see why it reduces to the absurd, right? So, and what do you do with that? Well, I always felt that anyways, right? So like, as an atheist, naturalistic, who reductionist, materialist, right? That just seemed inevitable to me, right? It seemed like if we're starting with a certain world picture, right, that's run by a certain principle of indifference, that we have atoms and the laws we use to combine them, and everything is just sort of supposed to be explained through some sort of combinatorial mode of explanation, right? Then it seems like we can't explain really jack from that at the end of the day. And that we do wind up in a sort of fundamental absurdity, including why we even have these atoms or laws to begin with. It's just sort of a random, like crazy brute fact, right? It's a radical worldview. People don't realize how radical this worldview is, right? Unless you actually take the time to, they think it's just science. Atheism is not science, right? It's often committed to a scientism, right? A certain epistemology or theory of knowledge that thinks that the only things we can know come through the hardest of hard sciences. That's not science. That's a philosophy, right? So Nietzsche was like somebody who always resonated with me because he seemed to be on like that same train of thought. Not all atheists are like that. Some atheists think that you can have these sort of crazy upfront commitments and still think that you can hold on to human rationality and morality, and they have very clever ways of trying. And I look at a lot of these proposals in my book, The Best Argument for God. I show why they don't work, why they're super contrived, why they don't fit with the inner logic of atheism, and why they ultimately don't even explain the things they're set out to explain anyways. But they try. But the thing I like about these old atheists and the existentialist absurdists is they're just kind of willing to like, light their cigar and just say, yeah, to hell with it, right? And I think that's right, but also deeply wrong. I think when you reduce to such an absurdity, you go back and you revise your starting point, right? You don't just sit in the absurdity. But I felt that. So like, so I had these like set of initial commitments, call them, Morian facts, things that just seem so obviously true to me that if my worldview cannot explain or accommodate these things, like the fact that it's wrong to like teach a little child to go torture a puppy for fun, right? The fact that I am an enduring subject, that I am the same being right now that I was 5 minutes ago, 10 years ago, right? Which is hard to make sense of if you just think that I'm like a bundle of particles or something like that, right? That there is real contingency in the world, that some things are but need not have been, right? Like these are things that my worldview better be able to give a good story that makes sense of these things. It doesn't force me to eliminate them, right? Atheism couldn't do that. To Clark's question, what's the practical side of this? Was life easier or harder upon becoming Catholic? Well, there's middle ground for me. So, like every sort of hipster American doofus, instead of looking at Christianity, I looked east first for spirituality, right? So I was big into Aldous Huxley for a while, and he's got this book, The Perennial Philosophy, which is like a sort of religious pluralism. So I was like kind of into religious pluralism, right? The idea that all religions are true in a sense, but also false, right? So pick whatever one does it for you type of deal. And that's convenient because then you can like kind of affirm like a vaguely comforting spiritual notion. You can even believe in God, but like, man, this moral system over here doesn't quite fit with what I'm up to, then I'll just take a little bit from Buddhism, take a little bit from Hinduism, kind of till I'm nice and comfortable. That didn't work for me for a lot of reasons. One is I just felt the force of Christianity, Catholicism was sufficiently powerful to override a religious pluralism, right? But also I just felt the force of traditional natural law morality as well, right? From a philosophical perspective. So yeah, I had a huge scroll of sins I had to give up, right? No guesses of what some of those might be. We don't need to go into details, but tons of things related to how I was living my life that needed to fundamentally and drastically change. I'll say this, some things were as hard as I expected to be. Some things I clearly just got some very special graces to overcome. So harder in the sense that I had real demands that I sincerely now wanted to live up to because I believed it, right? And those demands are not insignificant. But at the same time, I mean, grace is real. Grace is operative. And I really think that God does give you, he certainly gave me what you need to do it. Doesn't mean he'll give it to you all at once. I mean, Aquinas was big that, no, God will let you work through stuff over time, these habits. He's not going to override all your bad habits. I certainly found that that's true, but sometimes I think you get special graces where, yeah, he just kind of nukes a bad habit for you every now and then. Why he does that, that's in God's wisdom. I have no idea. Well, like, yeah, God totally took that sin away from me. Like, he totally just like gave me the spiritual crutch.
Yeah.
Other ones, he lets me just like hobble along like desperately, and for other people, it's very different. But that's how it was. That's how it was for me. That's how it is for me. I mean, sanctification is an ongoing process, right? Yeah.
So your podcast on philosophy is called Philosophy for the People. But I find that when I listen to it, it's a pretty technical philosophy podcast.
Yeah, I get that a lot. Yeah. I think highly of the people.
What is your goal with
Thank you.
What's your goal with the podcast?
My goal is to bring good philosophy to the people, right? I often find that it's done very poorly, that people are condescended to. So I'm kind of going against the what makes the algorithm happy, right? So a lot of my talks are kind of, I don't know, painfully academic, right? Kind of not really what might be immediately on people's minds, but I think they're on my mind. So I guess
I think it'll appeal to quite a few of our
but like these are the things philosophers really think about. They're discussed in the way that philosophers really discuss them, and I'm all about, it's like pull-ups, right? I think people can do pull-ups, but you got to work hard at them, right? But once you do that, once you can reach up and pull yourself up to that ledge, it gets easier. If that philosophy is the same way, the first time you read a dense philosophy book, you're like, it seems like the first time you try to do a pull-up is impossible, right? But what do? You work at it specifically, and then you reach that new ledge of understanding where you literally went from a state of understanding less to understanding more. People are intimidated by that, just like they're intimidated by pull-ups. I think that's a mistake. It's challenging. But the only way to do it, which I think everyone is capable of, is to actually just engage with it. So I'm trying to give entry points. I'm trying to help people along, but at the same time, I want to encourage that challenge. I want to encourage people to get into serious philosophy and to do it seriously. Not say everyone has to do it, but I think there's an opportunity there. There's certainly something it's being underserved so far as I can tell. And if that means I get, only 1,000 or 2,000 views versus 1.5 million for doing some cheesy cliche thing, that's fine. I'm happy with that.
So do you think, you mentioned natural law, and do you think we can find morality without God? Or to me, I'm like, without God, I'm in a gutter or something. I'm at a bar at noon. I don't know. Like, what? Yeah.
The answer is yes, but no. I mean, it's no, right? So I do think that God is the anchor of a successful, objective moral domain. But to make that full argument's a bit complicated, but I can at least give some of the highlights, right? So in moral philosophy and meta ethics specifically, higher level thought about what the good is, there's kind of two broad positions. There's moral realism and there's moral anti-realism. Now, moral realism just kind of affirms what I think is common sense for most people, that some things really are good, really are bad, that this language makes sense, that some things really are right, some things really are wrong, that we have moral obligations, prohibitions, or things we really ought to do, there's things we really ought not to do. Moral realism says, yep, that common sense mode of thought and language, it tracks something in reality that grounds that stuff, that grounds those moral facts, right? Moral anti-realism, and there's different kind of schools of thought within that camp, denies that, right? So they'll say there really are no moral facts or obligations. Again, it's not what it seems like for most people. It's kind of an illusion. There's really just sentiments, feelings, opinions, and these sort of moral assertions we make are really of no different of a status than the assertions we make concerning preferences of yogurt flavors or something like that, right? That'd be an anti-realist position. Now, I think on the face of it, it's quite obvious that your most mainstream forms of atheism are anti-realist, and many atheists are anti-realists, right? Now, why is that? Again, we'll think of the worldview as a whole, right? what we have are sort of indifferent forces, right, that are working on chunks of matter to shape them, and they evolve according to certain survival pressures. And I think the simplest, easiest, and frankly most common story of our moral beliefs are they are just beliefs that we formed that don't track any sort of objective moral domain, but they were just useful for, to put it crudely,
survival
avoid bears and have sex, right?
Yeah.
That's it. That is a simple, elegant, natural story to tell within that framework. I think that follows most simply. And if you're a reductionist, a physicalist, a naturalist, that's the story you should tell, right? And clearly you're not making sense of the moral data at that point. You're eliminating it, right? That's an eliminativist nihilist position, anti-realism.
I don't know with that position, like what motivates people to, like, at some level you might want to appear in a certain way for life to be easier, but do all the drugs and all the weird things behind closed doors. Because yeah.
I don't want to do like too much armchair psychology, like what motivates people. I think it's one or two, a combination of things. One is a prior commitment to this atheistic Darwinian paradigm, right? And if they have that prior commitment, they just see like, I guess this just sort of follows. It kind of sucks. It's not really how I act or live my life, but guess I'm stuck with it, right? So it's not like they like it, you know? And a lot of atheists kind of like begrudgingly accept it. It's like, I guess life is kind of nasty, but seems to be the case. Oh well, things aren't always what you want, right? Is there an element of just some people just kind of like the free-for-all idea that at the end of the day there's nothing with respect to like a natural law of being a kind of hedonist or something like that? I think we all know that's true, right? But as soon as you insinuate something like that, somebody's going to be shouting and how it's purely intellectual consideration. But we all know, wink, 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 intended, right? Yeah. Little column A, little column B, something like that, right? Okay, now look, not a lot, but a lot of atheists don't like that, right? Because they have, presumably, most of them have the same moral intuitions we are, and they're like, well, dang it, like, you know, rape and torture just don't seem like yogurt preferences, right? It seems like we're like on a different like category altogether here, right? So I got to tell some story, right? And so they have very contrived, very technical way. Some like bring in Platonism, right, to try and make sense of morality. So I take up some of these more complicated attempts in my book, and they are complicated, but at the end of the day, I think they break with the inner logic of naturalism. They're immensely contrived, often unintelligible, and don't secure the data in a way that it actually needs to be secured anyways, right? So I'll say that it's just mere assertion for now, right? Okay, so for the classical theist position, how do classical theists think about it? Well, their worldview is very different right at the start. This is important. It's not like, let me emphasize this. The atheists and theists agree on like everything versus one entity called God. No, the way the atheists and the theists see reality is totally different from start to bottom. And if you miss that, you ignore that, you're just gonna your arguments are gonna be pointless and unfruitful, right? So right at the beginning, theists aren't reductionists. We're not physicalists, right? We don't think that everything just reduces to atoms and physical laws. In fact, most theists think that physical laws just describe the way that certain natures, right? Things have natures like human natures or electron nature or cat nature, just operate under certain conditions, right? So natures, substantial forms, like these are the kind of fundamental things, right? The common sense things are kind of the really kind of like heart of reality, right? And they're composite objects of different principles. If you go back to Aristotle, like form and matter, or Aquinas will tell you essence and existence. But wrapped up into that is also a commitment of teleology, that certain natures, like human nature or tree nature, are dynamic centers of being that are actually oriented towards a particular end, which is their point of flourishing or excellence, right? So this is getting at the natural law tradition. So like and this is common sense, right? Like we all know that an oak tree that sinks like deeper roots and grows strong branches and has full leaves, like we say, that's a good instance of oak tree, right? That better fulfills like what it means to be an oak tree, right? It's hidden end. It has a a sort of more actuality or existence along the relevant lines versus an oak tree that doesn't sink deep roots. It's withering, it's weak. We say, yeah, that's a bad oak tree. It's lacking the sorts of features that go into an excellent instance of oak tree. Well, that's a simple cartoon illustration, but human beings are no different. We're just like more complicated, right? We too are oriented towards an end, theologically, the end of the beatific vision, to know the ultimate truth and to love the ultimate good, which is God, right? But as rational animals, we're meant to use our powers of reason and will, of rational willing, to discern what is really good for us along all the relevant dimensions and to pursue it, right? And this is where virtues come in. Virtues are just perfections of our powers, right? You have your big four cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude, right? And these are supposed to facilitate that state of flourishing, right? So natural law is a system of essences and aims, and what is really good for us, right? Really good for us, given our nature, are the sorts of things that we're obligated to pursue, right? And and people say, well, why do you want to pursue them? Well, I want to be happy, right? They say, well, what if we don't want to be happy? Well, too bad, because we all want to be happy by nature, right?
Yeah.
That itself is a normative element. So you could take a conditional, if I want to be happy, I should follow the dictates of the natural law, and realize that that's actually a categorical. By nature, we all want to flourish. We all want to be happy. Therefore, I ought to follow the dictates of the natural law. So we get this really binding normative moral force, right? Where if we all want to flourish, be happy in the Aristotelian sense, then we should follow the sort of dictates of our nature. Now, you'll notice when I said all that, I made no immediate reference to God aside from the beatific vision. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the right way to think about it. Like, we don't need to like have God immediately tell us everything to do. It's helpful. It's helpful. Yeah. And in fact, it's very befitting and appropriate, because most people aren't going to sit down and try and work through the natural law, right? So having some sort of, shortcut, right, is very befitting of human nature, right? Because Aquinas was big on this, right? Like, yeah, we can prove God exists, but it takes a lot of time. It's hard work. It's kind of hard, right? Same thing with the natural law. So having those just sort of authoritative decrees that also offer a certain specificity. Sometimes the natural law gives you general principles, but you kind of have to fill in specifics in other ways, right? Is very befitting to human nature. Now, where does God come in ultimately? Well, God is the ground of all being. He's the reason that any of these essences actually have existence or actuality in the first place. So I would argue that entire system of essentialism and Aristotelianism, that can only be made intelligible and actually attain if the God of classical theism exists. Mm-hmm. So that's a much more kind of complicated way to make a moral argument. But if you were to ask me, how do I think it all works out? Why is theism, to put it modestly, at least the best system for making sense of our moral experience compared to atheism? That's the sort of story I would tell. Yeah.
I feel a need to help our audience try to figure out why they want to put the work in on this, and because I think a lot of people who listen to our podcast aren't necessarily even going to follow all the terms used in the arguments you're making right now, right? And so this is coming as a friend of philosophy question. Like, I respect philosophy. I think it's good. It's necessary. It's necessary that we use our rationality and to explore God and reality and things, But like the closest I get to Thomism is usually like Joseph Pieper. And we read Joseph Pieper in our kind of long-running book club. Every year or so, we'll read a Joseph Pieper thing, and we just did Prudence. And what I notice when I read Joseph Pieper is he's doing better than most at like making it quite practical. And when we're doing our Prudence talk at like our book club, I know that like we could spend this whole time defining prudence for an hour and never talk about growing in prudence. Like never have any pastoral element or, take home point that will improve your life here directly, but just talk about the distinctions he's making on how you define prudence, right? And so I had to like shut down the conversation. I go, we're going to talk about what the definition of prudence is for 10 minutes, and then we're going to talk about being prudent, And I also see like saints that like don't know hardly any philosophy.
Yes.
Right. And even the whole Eastern Church seems to like be much more driven by spirituality and almost like weirdly ignoring philosophy at some point, But I guess where I'm going with this is like when I talk about worldview, I've noticed you talk about worldview in your channel, and I like what you're saying, but I mean something very different by it. I mean, like, there's a guy on my street who cares very much whether or not his city wins the Super Bowl. He cares about his kids. He cares about compassion. And he cares about a couple other things, right? And I'm kind of curious, and I'm kind of curious, like, when you say philosophy for the people, there's certainly a lot more people who could be doing the more serious philosophy, the type of philosophy that you're most worried about, than are, right? And you're giving a good way for them to get in. But for someone who, I'm sorry, one thing I should have added was, like, in Joseph Pieper, there's a few people in that audience who really want to debate the definitions. I think they're the ones who have the philosophy brain, and there's a whole lot of people wondering, why are we debating the definitions?
Yeah, some people can just be annoying too.
So I guess I'm kind of bringing this to, like, help me give, like, there's also this idea that, like, our brain isn't ever going to fully comprehend God.
Yeah.
Like, there's no article of faith or natural reason to believe that we were built that way that we could. So, like, what is, like, the value and for this guy who wants the Chiefs to win the Super Bowl?
I wanted the Lions to win the Super Bowl.
I kind of did too, and I live in Kansas City.
No. So I lived in Michigan for a number of years, and I always kind of rooted for the Lions as a joke because I was the worst team, and then, like, suddenly they're doing well, and I guess all right, I guess I'm in for it now. All right, what's the value of this? Well, I don't think everybody needs to do it, and I think it would be inappropriate if everybody even tried to do it, right? You don't need to do this sort of philosophy to get to heaven, that's for sure, right? It's, you mentioned all the saints, but just think of the grandma in the pew, right? She's not going to, like, articulate to you, like, Aristotle's system of hylomorphism, but she's probably holier and better off than a lot of people who could or would, right? So, speaking personally, I'll say that I couldn't do anything else, right? I mean, I've just always felt like to be deeply motivated in a certain direction, I kind of have to know that it's true, or at least have a lot more confidence in it than otherwise, right? So that's a me thing. I know not everybody is like that. I also think that most people have a very natural and intuitive knowledge of God and the natural law as well. And so I think they're justified in that. I actually think that we can say that they know that God exists and they know what is right and wrong, even if they can't give any arguments for it. And that relates to my wider sort of Aristotelian epistemology. So I don't even think that somebody needs to, like, work it out philosophically to have a rational basis for faith. That's a position I hold, right? So you don't need to do it if you don't want to do it. How could it be helpful? Well, if you're like me and you just kind of have to see if something's true, then I think philosophy is your best bet there. I think it's definitely better than science. I think philosophy is the only sort of discipline that can actually get at the sorts of questions that have huge religious significance, like God's existence, right? I also think that it can bring to light certain things that are worthy of consideration on a daily basis, as long as you're not going into like here's where I just think, like, reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics would just be fine, right? Because I think most people, like, other things equal, aren't gonna, like, be worse off by just, like, learning about the cardinal virtues. Mm-hmm. If they spend the next 7 years debating the definition of prudence, I think Aristotle himself would say that was imprudent, right? I mean, here's what you need to know about prudence, right? It's practical, moral street smarts, right? That's what prudence is. And prudence, we say, has 3 faces, right? One face looking to the past of prior experience and the things you've learned. One face in the here and now looking at the current circumstances, and one face looking at the future, because that's where we want to go, right? So that's the idea of prudence. And prudence is the chariot virtue, right? It's the virtue that carts the other virtues, that helps us to understand what sorts of decisions to make in certain, always relative circumstances for the best and most virtuous outcome. And that itself requires, so I mean, philosophy will teach you that requires living, not just reading, right? So something you should get out of your philosophical study, if you're doing it right, of Aristotle, is that you need to go live. You need to go practice being, practice being, not just reading about, a moral, as in prudent person. I mean, some Aristotelians think that all morality actually just reduces to prudence. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. But that's an instance, Clark, that maybe where if you're actually being attentive in your philosophical studies, it would inspire you to some immediate action in your life. Because I see the problem you're talking about. It's a problem I've fallen into too. Like, it's easy to just kind of like get wrapped up in the books. And I'd say if I have a particular trap, that's rather than go to adoration, right, or something like that. It's something I'm aware of, something I've been working on.
So we, like at our ministry, we get like a lot of volunteers every year, and some years more than others, like we really have to challenge like assumptions that people have about, you know, like suffering or poverty, and if you're kind of reducing things to a sort of more material, you know, existence, then that affects the type of help you want to offer a person. And is that the type of help we really want to offer? And so I feel like we have to do these sort of checks of people's worldviews because it's not coherent, you know.
It's a great point. You're talking about, you know, you run some philosophical therapy on people, right?
Yeah.
And yourself. I mean, there's a reason that one of the greatest works of philosophy is called The Consolation by Boethius. Yeah. The Consolation. Now, what's going on there? He's a man who's about to be put to death. He's kind of freaking out, right? And philosophy comes to console him. And why is that possible? Because your worldview obviously is hugely significant for how you look at everything, right? Including death, including suffering. Whether suffering is something that is always and everywhere bad, or whether suffering could in some sense be medicinal, purposeful, integrated into a wider, more meaningful whole. Doesn't mean we don't want to try to alleviate it, right? But when we're just stuck with it, right, what is our perspective on it? That's something that a study of philosophy could be a real therapy for, right? If you're a nihilist, you think your life is worthless, and you're thinking about ending it, you have a worldview that kind of encourages ending it, right? Euthanasia. That's significant on a practical level. And that's something that's culturally very big right now. I think we're just seeing this sort of logical ends of this throwaway culture with respect to life. This is a nihilistic culture. Whereas if you have a worldview with a sort of binding natural law that says your life has objective meaning, purpose, value, goodness, even if you think it doesn't, right? And that it would be wrong to prematurely end somebody's life, including your own, for that. Like, again, those are significant practical implications of a wider worldview. So in that sense, yeah, why the Catholic in the pew I don't think needs to do like deep philosophical apologetics. There's a lot of people who aren't Catholics in the pews, where sort of philosophical therapy or worldview construction, I think, could radically improve their overall life perspective and itself facilitate a completely different course of action. It did for me, right?
Yeah. There's like a lot of assumptions about there's a lot of like if you are sort of nurturing yourself in the faith, there's a lot of just built-in assumptions and understanding about the world, but maybe not everyone has been steeped in it.
The church is a great teacher, right? She's there to guide, and that's great. Yeah. We should be plugged in. And to the extent you're plugged into that, you don't really need Aristotle's ethics.
But I think it's like that's not the only. It's not the only influence that we have, most of us, you know. So I think if someone who maybe was not going to make it through I think I saw this on your Substack. You said Thomism makes sense of our strongest intuitions, and I liked that idea. And so, but if someone's not going to get through the Summa, where would you tell them to start?
Of everything for Aristotle, I think that's your best shot. But even that could be a bit much to chew on if you're just starting out. I'd recommend something even a little bit more contemporary and helpful. I mean, I don't think my book would be bad. I think my book, to be totally self-serving, I intentionally introduce people to a lot of different branches and aspects of philosophy to get my arguments going. So you might consider that. But another guy I really like is Mortimer Adler. And Mortimer Adler himself converted to Catholicism in his 90s, right?
Oh, wow.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
So lifelong kind of journeyer seeker, was originally, pagan, then became maybe Episcopalian or something, and finally, a couple of years before he died, he lived a long time, became Catholic. He's got a lot of great books that I think are awesome for beginners. I'll give two. One is called 10 Philosophical Mistakes. And this is really a brief tour of the history of philosophy, and it shows how ideas have consequences. And he looks at certain ideas that were introduced through the course of history that he thinks were bad ideas that led to this sort of philosophical mess we're in. He picks on John Locke a lot and stuff like that. And his corrective, of course, is, hey, let's look back towards Aristotle and Aquinas, right? But that's a great book because that will give you a good overview of lots of different philosophical schools of thought on different issues. And he's got another one, if you're interested in Aristotle, called Aristotle for Everyone or Everybody. I forget which one it is, but you can find it. And that is exactly what it sounds like. It's a great little philosophical introduction to the thought of Aristotle that if you read that before you or concurrently with the ethics, I think you'll get a lot more out of it.
And your book is called The Best Argument for God?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, well, Pat, you're famous for kind of another idea in another book that has to be, is it called How to Be Good at Everything?
And modestly titled How to Be Better at Almost Everything.
I think you have lots of modest titles. The Journal of Absolute Truth.
The Journal of Absolute Truth, my Substack, right, yeah.
And I'm sympathetic with this idea that you're promoting here, but can you summarize the idea? And I also want to kind of know, like, if you're talking to a 22-year-old who just graduated college in a non-applied degree, or they're not an engineer, or a nurse, or if you're talking to a high school grad, what type of advice would you give someone right now in this, world economy, et cetera, with your generalism idea?
Yeah. So background, this book was written in 2019. And it's the idea that in today's world, I was kind of aiming largely at people who wanted to, start their own business, be an entrepreneur, et cetera. But I think it applies more broadly than that. But the argument is you're better off being an expert generalist rather than a hyper specialist. So get good to great, or at least fairly competent at lots of different things, and then learn to stack your skills to form competitive and creative advantages. And this idea kind of came out of just a reflection of my own experience, like in fitness. Like I'm not a fitness hyper specialist. I've never won any powerlifting or bodybuilding competitions or something like that. But I've been able to, make a living and build a business around it because I stack different skills, right? I've got backgrounds in writing and philosophy and marketing, something I studied for many years. And it was that sort of that soup, the soup of different skills that allowed me to stand out in a very noisy industry where there's a lot of people who are a lot bigger, stronger, faster than I am, right? And so I built out this idea of skill stacking in that book to encourage people to kind of go against the conventional wisdom. Because at least when I was growing up, I was told, no, you just focus on one thing and super special, like even it's your degree. And yeah, I think that while that can make sense for some people, I think life is a lot more interesting. I think there's a lot more opportunities to be a generalist. And I think when you look at some of the big successes, they tend to be more generalists than hyper specialists. I always tell people that being a generalist doesn't mean being a jack of all trades, master of none. I think you can be a master of many things. Just not worried about being the best in the world at any one, right? So I give lots of case studies in my book of, high-powered entrepreneurs and CEOs who just have a wide command over lots of different skills. And even some goofier examples like Hulk Hogan, right? People are like, oh, he's the greatest wrestler of all time. Fake wrestler, I guess. But you ask like wrestling fans, like, nah, he kind of sucked at wrestling, right? He actually wasn't that good of a wrestler, right? Or he was at best like okay, but he had lots of skills. He was a great communicator. He was an amazing marketer. He knew how to put on a show, and it was just that total package of different skills that allowed him to stand out as the world's greatest wrestler, even though he definitely, from a technical perspective, wasn't, right? I use other musical examples. Take the band Kiss, the greatest rock band in the world, right? Has anybody ever been so confused to think that any one of those guys were like the best at their instruments? Okay. But boy, they put on a show, right? Like they're different. They've got different skills. Again, Gene Simmons is like he's a brilliant marketer, brilliant promoter. You know, their showmanship, their pyrotechnics, all this. It's the different skills that they had to stand out as people that were certainly far from like the most virtuosic musicians, right? So my advice to the 20 something is the advice I really kind of gave myself around that age is I'm going to spend the next 10 years getting as good at as many different things as I can, right? I think 10 years is a good amount of time for that. So take 10 years and work as hard as you can to get good at as many relevant and interesting things as you can. People are like, well, Pat, I'm 45. Okay, well, then from 45 to 55, work as hard as you can to get as good as many different skills as you possibly can. People sometimes laugh at this advice, but that's the best advice I can give, right? I mean, chances are you're probably planning to live the next 10 years anyways. I think all of us are. So why not spend that time trying to get better at things, right? It's not that hard. I talk about this in the book of different ways of approaching different skills, of how to actually go about skill development and practice and stuff like that. It takes effort, but I use a lot of fitness analogies. I don't think it's ever too late to start. But the way I saw it was this, is I just said to myself, hey, if I spend the next 10 years just working really hard to get good at things, chances are I'll be good enough at the things that I need to be good at that I could kind of do the things I want to do for a living. And I was able to make a living far before those 10 years were up, but working on things like my writing, my salesmanship, my copywriting, my marketing, my communication skills, public speaking, of course, the fitness side of things too, had to get in shape. Lots of other skills on the business end, persuasion, logic, Aristotle's classic, rhetoric, all those sorts of things, right? And I talk about these kind of like, I call them meta skills in the book. Like these are skills like everybody should have, like skills in persuasion, skills in logic, skills in writing. No matter who you are, these can only help you. They're not gonna hurt you, right? And then you sort of can think about conjoining those to the skills that interest you, right? I mean, music, I've been a musician all my life, and most of my time right now is actually spending time and learning tunes for a Van Halen tribute band that I'm in Milwaukee currently. Right?
That's awesome.
I spend more time on that than I do my actual PhD at this point. So the music's a great example of this. Like the musicians on YouTube who stand out, they tend to be very good at their instrument. Like you can't suck at the thing, right? But they also tend to be very good at video production, right? That's like a deal breaker. So like that's a simple skill stack, right? Because you have a million amazing guitarists, right? But their production sucks. But then you have somebody who's just a good guitarist, but also a good or great video and audio editor, and then boom, their channel blows up. That's a great example where a skill stacking person clearly dominates a hyper specialist, right? And if you keep your eye out for this, I think you'll realize more and more, especially in the online space, it's generalists who are really dominating the scene, not the hyper specialists. Mm-hmm.
I see a huge interaction of what you're saying in entrepreneurship, and I feel like our education and society is gearing young people away from entrepreneurship all the time, like with blinders on, meaning like I think the top 10% of a state school graduate has enough intelligence and work ethic to found a company. It won't be like a fintech company. It won't necessarily be an internet influencer or something like that. But I think even if it's just a roofing company, and I find that this like thing that's holding people from endeavoring into this space is this like fear of like going down to City Hall and learning enough accounting. And, like, okay, maybe I could be a great roofer, but could I do the accounting? Could I do the sales? Could I go down to City Hall and register a corporation? And it's like, yes, you can, like you just need to like kind of get.
Yes, you can, but you don't even have to, right? So like I took a number of accounting courses in college. I'll tell you, the one thing that taught me is I never want to do my own accounting.
Right.
Outsourcing.
I think when you start, you're going to have an Excel sheet, though, and do your own accounting for a minute.
The basics you need sorting out are very manageable. Once you get going, one of the first people you hire is an accountant. Simple as that, right?
Well, the basics are where the gold are,
I don't know if this is our education or if it's just a human tendency to be afraid to do things without being an expert in them. Like it's like, well, I can't do that because I don't know, but I think people think they need to cover this, and get into all the nitty gritty. And an argument you make in your book is you don't need to be better than 80% at anything to be successful. And maybe even 80% is
too much.
Too much, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, my undergrad was finance and econ, and then I did philosophy for master's, and I'm doing the PhD now. And same thing, like the basics of finance for starting your own business are nothing. Like if you have a degree in finance, you're doing way, way, way more than you would ever need as a small business owner. It's hardly even relevant, right?
I'm convinced that an Econ 100 level class has all the gold of economics in it. And that every layer after that is way diminishing returns.
I mean, you just start getting into all these different, models and stuff like that, right? Yeah. So, man, it's been a long time since I thought about that stuff. But right. I mean, you just don't need any of that. You're starting out. You don't have, the other thing about being a generalist too is even if you have a command of certain things, doesn't mean you have to do those, right? Oftentimes just having some basic competency is something, it just makes you that much more effective of choosing the right people to fill that role, right? When you actually understand what goes into it. So a good generalist is somebody, of course, who it's sooner rather than later begins to delegate, hire, assign specialists, right? The generalist runs the specialists. That's how it works.
I have a couple questions about ideas in your book. The first is from your book, I learned the very technical term, the butt mind.
Is that my book? Yeah, the butt mind. Like I said before we aired, that book came out in 2019.
2019. Okay,
which
all
means
right.
I definitely wrote it like at least a year and a half before because publishing is slow.
So 20.
And I have this horrible tendency of like once my book's out, I never look at it again.
Oh yeah,
I just want to change everything, right? I just want to change it.
Right. No, that's right. That's right.
I'll take your word for it.
So the butt mind. So the butt mind is, when you sit down to write, that tells you like, no, I should get a cup of tea first, or
sure, yeah.
The butt mind doesn't want to take your butt to the gym. I think it was BUTT, not the BUT.
Yeah, I'll have to revisit. That was probably like a spur of the moment idea.
Okay, well, no, I thought it was great because it's like you sit down to do some work, you need to concentrate, and it's like getting a cup of tea to help you out sounds really high-minded, but then when it's like, no, your butt mind that doesn't want to keep the butt in the chair is telling you to get the tea, all of a sudden it changes how you feel about getting the tea, I think. Do you have any words of wisdom about focus and discipline?
It's a skill. That's it. You got to shut the door. You got to 2 hours a day is what I say. If it's important, 2 hours a day. If you want to write for 2 hours a day. You want to play guitar, 2 hours a day. I mean, there's some exceptions, right? I don't recommend working out for 2 hours a day.
Yeah.
Deadlifting is a little bit more demanding than writing. But for a lot of skill development, I think it's really important to just sit down and just practice. Like, shut the door, turn off the phone, close the Facebook window on your computer, and just get to work. And people are terrible at it. They're terrible at it because they're in the opposite habit of this crazy social media world where their attention span is only 10 seconds. There's no easy fix here. You have to understand that this is a skill that is probably very weak right now for most people, because it is. And the only way to improve it is to practice it like anything else. Get your butt in the chair, shut the door, and shut the doors to help with external extractions. Right. I have 6 of those downstairs right now, right? Because those are real things too. And just get to work, right? And stay on the job till the job is done. That's the rule, right? This idea of treating any skill like a professional, not a hobbyist, right? A professional shows up on time and they stay on the job until the job is done. Right. And I just asked them 2 hours. 2 hours is not a lot of time. Yeah. People think 2 hours, something. No, that's not a lot of time.
Oh, yeah.
Well, and once you're in the habit of something, like I easily write usually for like 4 to 6 hours a day. Right. Just 2 hours is a good practice window where if you do it every day, you'll improve your focus and you'll notice genuine improvements in the skill set for sure.
Yeah. This is a thing I've talked about with mom friends. It's like this, you've got the triangle, like clean house, robust prayer life, and a healthy body, And it's like, at best, I feel like I can do 2 of those, but you have your hands in a lot of things. How do you?
Yeah, I mean, I always balance it perfectly. It's funny you say that. That's in fitness. There's an analogy there too. They call it the natty triangle, the natural triangle, right?
Oh, the idea there big muscles.
Yeah, or lean, right? Or lean body, right?
Yeah.
But, or you can have both if you take steroids, right? You don't want to do that, right? Either way, I call it the problem of shirts, right? So you can either like fill out your shirt but be a little bit chunky, or you can like be lean but you kind of look skinny with a shirt on, right? That's kind of like you can have one or the other, but not both. Unless you take steroids, which I don't recommend, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, look, life, so I talk about this in the book, is that there's always this kind of surging and maintaining that you have to approach things at. You can't do everything at once. It's impossible, right? And this, again, is another analogy drawn from fitness. I mean, just think about gaining muscle and losing fat. If you try to do both at the same time, you're going to go in circles because one requires an energy surplus, one requires an energy deficit. It's better to do this. Focus on one at a time, like you surge in one area, and you just try to maintain the other, right? So I'm going to try and gain muscle, but not gain too much fat, right? Just kind of try and keep steady. Then once I feel like, okay, I've put on the muscle I want, then switch focus, right? Try to lean down, but hold on to as much muscle as you can. And so this kind of push and pull helps you get more overall than if you try to do everything at once. And that's, I offer the same advice for general skill pursuits. You can't pursue too many at one time. Usually I'm just kind of like 2 at a time kind of guy, right? You said this, right? But you kind of maintain everything else. So the other ones don't drop off completely, but instead of 2 hours a day, you just have some sort of basic maintenance program. And fitness will teach you this, but so will bike riding, that it's a lot easier to maintain something than it is to gain it in the first place. It's also a lot easier to gain it back up to a certain level after it slid after you got it the first time. And so don't worry if things slide a little bit. That's natural, right? If I bring my guitar practice down from 2 to 3 hours a day to just 30 minutes, I'll slide on certain things, right? And that's happened lots of times. But I know if I then have 3 months where I push it back, I'll regain that stuff pretty quickly, right? And you just have to be like okay psychologically with that, right? Because sometimes people see things slipping and like, oh no. But that's, if you want to be a generalist, you have to get used to that, right? That as you push more into certain areas, other ones will kind of slide back. You do what you can to just kind of hold them up to a reasonable standard. And just realize that you over time, this pushing, this pulling, and this switching focus, that will cause you to expand as a whole in a much more efficient and realistic manner over time. Yeah. So don't try and do everything at once. You'll lose burnout.
Hey, Pat, I want to thank you for being on our podcast, and thank you for covering all this ground.
Thank you for having me. It was a very enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
That was our interview with Pat Flynn. If you want to know more from Pat, or if the way he speaks and talks about things is interesting to you, he's got his Substack, The Journal of Absolute Truth. He has his podcast, Philosophy for the People, and he has a bunch of workout videos on YouTube under his name too. But he said that if you want to go get the best kettlebell stuff or workout stuff, go to a website, I think, called the 100 Kettlebell Workouts. All right. We have had more people use our call-in line, and Laura and I are going to respond to some comments on the call-in line next episode. But to remind you, if you want to email us, please email us. I believe it's asimplehouse@gmail.com. And if you want to call in with your comments, which would be awesome, I get excited when I get any type of voicemail on that call-in line. The number for the call-in line is 913-390-3672. I'm going to double check that. Yep. 913-390-3672. Also, a belated thanks to our listener in Louisiana who sent me molasses. I have been breaking apart my kids' gingerbread houses, dipping the gingerbread in the molasses and eating it. It's Steen's or Stein's molasses from Louisiana. It's good. I feel like I'm not enough of an aficionado to tell if it's better or worse than the off-the-shelf stuff at the grocery store, though. But I just think it's cool to get it. So thank you for that, and talk to you guys later. Please like, subscribe, comment. Tell us what you think of the podcast. Peace out.